Alright, reading this page over. What happened in China after the one-child policy was put into effect? In successive 5-year time blocks, the TFR fell from 6.6 children per woman in 1960 to 1965 to 4.86 5 years later to 3.32 and also to 2.55 and also to 2.46 to below replacement at 1.92 in 1990 to 1995 and to 1.80 in 1995 to 2000. Both the 2000 and 2002 UN volumes showed the Chinese TFR at 1.8 children per woman. Obviously, something very significant had happened. The Chinese TFR had dropped by 4.26 children per woman over the course of just 40 years. How to put the Chinese fertility decline in perspective? Not so easily. During the same time in all the less developed countries, excluding China, fertility had declined from 6.16 children per woman to 3.3. That is a drop of 2.8 children. That too was an enormous change, but less than the Chinese unfree fall of 4.26. On the other hand, just across the Yellow Sea from China, another peasant society was also transforming itself. The South Korean TFR had been 6.33 in the late 1950s and just 1.41 children per woman in 2000 to 2005. As mentioned, it was then reported by the government at 1.17 for 2003. Thus, the South Korean TFR had dropped by 5.16 children from its peak year to the present, starting higher and falling faster than China's, to a lower point. The South Koreans did this without a coercive reproductive policy and with rapid economic growth up towards European levels. A similar sort of story can be told about Taiwan. By 1999, according to the U.S. Bureau of Census International Data, to the database, the Taiwanese TFR was 1.55 children per woman. The 1998 rate was lower, 1.47 children per woman, believed to have been linked to the Year of the Tiger, regarded as inauspicious for female births in Chinese societies. The below replacement story was not just one modern country's and a few exceptional LCDs. When the 2000s revisions were published, 16 LCDs had fallen below the replacement level, just like China. When the 2002 revisions were published, 20 LCDs showed below replacement rates, and the number was rising, with Brazil and Mexico expected to join the group soon. Beyond the coercion needed to enforce it, there is another problem with the national ideal of the one-child family policy. Nick Aberstadt has written about life in such circumstances. For such a world to come about, it would be one where children grew up without brothers or sisters, uncles, aunts, or cousins, and with as many as 14 parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, assuming rising life expectancies. In these nations, the classic diagram of the population pyramid would soon look like a population pole. In other words, in a one-child family, the child's only direct relatives are all ancestors. Would that change the nature of our behavior? It might. For one example, compared to parents with 3 children, parents with 1 might not allow their child to take the responsible risks associated with learning about the world. For another, while the data is not locked in, it is apparent that sex ratios in China are changing rapidly. Eberstadt reports that in China's 1953 and 1954 census, there were 104 to 105 boy babies to 100 girl babies. About normal. In the 1982 census, the ratio was 109. In 1990, it was 111, then 116 in 1995, and 118 in November 2000, in the 2000 count. Why? Oh, damn it. Pollen or something. I can't tell. Why? First, a powerful cultural preference for sons. Second, sub-replacement fertility due to the one-child family rules. Third, the widespread availability of prenatal sex selection through sonograms and other technology. Sex selection? Ah, yes. Jesus Christ. Eugenics over gender? Okay. And subsequent abortion based on the sex of the fetus. This can produce major problems in the future. It is likely that in the decades to come, 10 to 15% of Chinese men will be unmarriageable victims of a bride shortage. In theory, this would lower Chinese fertility. Other potential examples of changing behavior are present in Chapter 13. The Chinese situation is a prime example of the powerful role of the momentum in modern demography. Consider carefully how it works. It is a crucial aspect of the new demography. Every birth at the moment of delivery requires both a woman and a baby. The baby's birth is reflected in current fertility rates, but what about the mother? She was not born today, nor born yesterday. Obviously, she was born, let us say, about a quarter of a century ago, in 1975 to 1980. At that time, the fertility rate in less developed countries were not... Okay. At the time, the fertility rate in the less developed countries was not the current 1.9. It was 4.6 children per woman. That means there is a fat cohort of young potential mothers today. Even if they bear relatively fewer children, even somewhat below the replacement rate, but a while population will still rise. For a while, population will still rise. Sorry. That's how momentum works. Thus, China's fertility rate will fall below replacement in the early 1990s, but its total population will grow about by 2025 before leveling off and shortly thereafter beginning a decline, and the growth until 2025 will be substantial. China's population in 2000 was 1.28 billion. In 2025, it will be 1.45 billion. That increase is a modest 13%, but it adds up to 170 million people, a massive increase, and about to the current population of Brazil, in the world's 50th largest countries. So it's talking about increases within the standards of despite the collapse, because obviously we're still rising as a species, and I think there's he tries to make that clear a little bit, but yeah. Okay. Because of the momentum effect, one of the major arguments in population circles today is not so much whether the fertility averages for the less developed countries will fall to the replacement levels and be below, but when it will happen. If the decline is replacement level and below proceeds relatively quickly, the results from momentum will be relatively small. There will be fewer people of reproductive age 20 or 30 years from now, about when total global population might begin its decline. That would make it harder to reflect population numbers, if that is then considered desirable, and total global population numbers would be lower. But if the decline in fertility happens more slowly, the momentum effect will push towards the time when global population begins in decline. Demographers who believe that current population is essentially harmful, like John Bongartz of the Population Council, insist that we must act as quickly as possible to bring the LCD fertility rates down quickly, mostly through more extensive family planning and economic aid. Remember, population will grow from about 6 billion to 8 billion before declining. In either case, at least according to the remarkable new UN medium variant projections, global population will be officially declining. Many of us saw this coming years ago. Making it official is what makes it remarkable. Such a story, promulgated by the UN, headlined by the New York Times, couldn't be just a one-day story. It was a two-day story. Consider now India, the only nation other than China whose population numbers go into 10 figures, just over 10 billion in the year 2000. As recently as the early 1970s, Indian women were bearing an average of 5.5 children. 5.43. Then fertility began plummeting, reaching 3.01 in the current estimate. Some of the large Indian provinces are already below replacement level, but the national TFR is still above replacement, and the Indian median age at 23 is lower than the Chinese median age of 30, in large part because the momentum intensified by young age structure. India will be growing faster than China. Indeed, by about 2035, India is expected to overtake China and become the most populous nation in the world. Its population in 2045 is projected to break the 1.50 billion mark, still climbing to about 1.53 billion by 2050, by which time sparse China would have dwindled to a mere 1.40 billion people, and India would soon begin its population decline. Like China, India has already tried to limit population growth, sometimes pushing close to the limits of coercion, occasionally crossing it. When Indira Gandhi was prime minister, 1966 to 1977, to 1980 to 1984, bonuses were given to women who had their tubes tied after a pregnancy. This is legitimate. A woman was encouraged to act in a certain way by the government, so carrot. For a man, a payment of a few rupees was tendered if he agreed to a vasectomy. Vasectomy peddlers receive a bonus each year peasant male he could bring to the clinic for a vasectomy. Such is the way social engineering works. Jeez. I guess that makes sense. But in 1975, Miss Gandhi declared emergency rule, the equivalent of martial law, undermining India's great claim to fame as the world's largest democracy. Encouraged by her son Sanjay, she applied pressure to meet sterilization quotas. Public employees' salaries were tied to a number of acceptors they brought in for sterilization. Fines and imprisonment were threatened. Food rations were withheld from the unsterilized. In some cases, procedures were performed without the woman's knowledge. This is not legitimate. It is clearly coercive. Some in the population business were pleased by the policies. Robert McNamara, then president of the World Bank, stopped off in India during the emergency rule and applied, quote, the political will and determination shown by the leadership of the highest level in intensifying the family planning drive with a rare courage of conviction. And Paul Ulrich was critical of the United States for not supporting mandatory sterilization of all Indian men with 3 or more children. Jeez. He said, quote, we should have volunteered logistical support in the form of helicopters, vehicles, and surgical instruments. We should have sent doctors. Coercion? Perhaps, but coercion is a good cause. Whoa. Oh, Ben's not saying that. That was Paul, by the way. End quote. Jeez. Such coercive practices lasted only a few days. India is a democracy, and when voters got wind of what was going on, Miss Gandhi was voted out of office. The issue of coerced family planning was one of the reasons democracy offers people a powerful role in how they choose to run their lives. In general, this is a blessing. How leaders think people ought to behave is not always the way people want to behave. In India, particularly in the rural areas, boy babies are valued more than girl babies, and so today sex selection has become an issue. Technicians travel from village to village with portable sonogram instruments, telling pregnant women that the sex of their fetuses. This has apparently happened, led to abortions based on gender. The normal ratio of boys to girls at birth is 103 to 105 baby boys for every 100 baby girls. Today in India, according to its 2001 sentence, for every 100 girl baby born, there are 108 boy babies born. The ratio may well climb still higher, as it has in China. Beyond the billionaire nations, most of the rest of Asia is following a pace. Asian fertility has fallen from 5.7 in 1965 to 1970 period to 2.55 in the current period. Many of the smaller Asian nations are already well below the replacement level, including South Korea, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Taiwan, and Singapore. In addition, some of the former Soviet Union republics have also fallen below the 2.1 threshold, including Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Many demographic rules have been broken on the road to the new demography. First was probably the one about Catholics, because the policy of the Catholic Church regarding birth control and abortion, it was assumed that Catholic fertility worldwide would be higher than Protestant rates. For many years that was true. In the United States, for example, the Catholic TFR in the early parts of the 20th century is believed to have been substantially higher than the Protestant TFR. Italian immigrants, for example, were known for their large families, but that changed. These days, the U.S. fertility rates for Catholics and Protestants are about the same. Attitudinal surveys also show that Catholics and Protestants have similar views on birth control and abortion. More dramatic than the American situations is what has happened in Europe. Through 1980 to 1985, the nations in Europe that were predominantly Catholic, mostly Southern European, had higher fertility rates than those European nations which were predominantly Protestant, mostly Northwestern. Thus, in 1970 to 1975, the peoples of the nations of Southern Europe had a TFR of 2.45 children per woman, while the Northern Europeans had already fallen below replacement level, 2.08 children per woman. Then, for no apparent reason, the bottom fell out of Southern European fertility. The current rate in Southern Europe is calculated at 1.32 children per woman, an amazingly low number. Among the lowest fertility rates in the European arena are the Italian, 1.23, and the Spanish, 1.15. Meanwhile, Northern European rates have also declined substantially to 1.6 children per woman, but are higher than the Southerners after starting much lower. In Europe today, Protestants have more children than Catholics. In the early 1970s, the TFR for all of South America was 5.8 children per woman. Observers who worried about the population growth looked at this essentially Catholic continent and shuddered. How could fertility ever be expected to fall so quickly? South America would be overflowing with humanity. It is not, and it will not be. Today, the South American TFR is at 2.45 and falling quite rapidly. The sharp decline is led by the biggest Latin American country, Brazil, which had a TFR of 6.15 in the early 1960s. Today, the listed Brazilian rate is 2.2, but Brazilian demographers say that the TFR has already crossed into demographic territory and that further declines are clearly in the offing. In the offing? Okay. What is more remarkable about the Brazilian situation is that there has never been a government. Oh, sorry, just checking. There's never been a government program or policy to reduce fertility through non-government organizations in Brazil have rigorously promoted fertility guidance. That fact is not often stressed in the population alarm industry. The second largest Latin American country is Mexico, also predominantly Catholic, and of particular interest in the United States. The Mexican TFR was 6.95 in the late 1950s, 7 children per woman, but 2000 to 2005 it was listed to 2.50. As mentioned, many Mexican demographers report that the Mexican TFR is now at about replacement level and falling. This stark decline may well change immigration flows into the United States. Economic development is supposed to correlate with low fertility, isn't it? But Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and three most economically advanced and Western-oriented modern South American nations have TFRs of 2.4, 2.35, and 2.30 respectively. Their TFRs have fallen more slowly than the South American average. Why? I don't know, and the experts don't know either. Is demography destiny? The question is always with us and often surfaces with particular urgency at times of international tension. Such a view arises with particular potency during each Israel-Palestinian crisis, as we're sort of dealt with last year and still is, I think. Oh wait, am I thinking of something else? Alright. Israel, we are told, is under the demographic gun as well as under fire from homicide bombers. In the New York Times in 2002, columnist Nicholas Kristof noted that Palestinians bear twice the number of children per woman as do Israelis, therefore making the Israeli settlements in the West Bank steadily less tenable. But Kristof was a beaming optimist compared to historian Paul Kennedy, who in the 1980s wrote that Japan would soon surpass America as the world's economic powerhouse. Writing for the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, Kennedy wrote that, quote, hundreds of millions, literally hundreds of millions, end quote, of young Arabs and Muslims will be on the warpath as a, quote, demographic boiling over, end quote, yields, quote, overpopulation, poverty, and young male frustration to carry out attacks against the West and Israel in particular, end quote, which will, quote, obliterate Israel or drive it to some desperate action, end quote. Kennedy wrote that he was incredibly gloomy. Calm down, Paul. Sheesh. Alright, that's that video for now.